بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم الحمد لله رب العالمين وصلى الله على سيدنا محمد وعلى آله وأصحابه أجمعين اللهم علمنا ما ينفعنا وانفعنا بما علمتنا وزدنا علما اللهم إنا نسألك علما ينفعنا اللهم إنا نسألك علما نافعا ورزقا واسعا وعملا متقبلا وشفاء من كل داء نوينا التعلم والتعليم والتذكر والتذكير والإفادة والاستفادة والحث على التمسك بكتاب الله وسنة رسوله صلى الله عليه وآله وصحبه وسلم وبعد السلام عليكم ورحمة الله تعالى وبركاته. Alhamdulillah, we thank and praise Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala for once again affording us the opportunity to come to such a gathering whereby we seek to gain access to the straight path and be guided along the straight path. We are currently discussing certain transactions. We are looking at the sale. A very simple example would be, I sell this miswak to you for 25 rands. I sell this miswak to you for 25 rands. You purchase the miswak from me for 25 rands. We've looked at the integrals of a sale. In order to have a sale, you need to have a seller, myself. You need to have a buyer, yourself. You need to have a commodity, and you need to have a counter value. The commodity in this particular instance would be the miswak. That's the commodity. The counter value would be 25 rands. There is another integral according to the Shafi school of thought, and that is what we refer to in Arabic as the sigha. Sigha basically refers to a formulae. So strictly speaking, according to the Shafi'i school of thought, if you want to enact a sale, if you want to have an exchange of goods, I sell you the miswak for 25 rands. So I give you the miswak, you give me the 25 rands. According to the Shafi madhab, strictly speaking, in order for that sale to be validly enacted, you need a formulae. In other words, you need an offer to sell, and you need an offer to purchase. We refer to it as a sigha. In general, and sometimes an extraneous example does help. An extraneous example here would be a marriage. So you have a bride and you have a bridegroom. They want to get married. You need a marriage contract. How do we enact that contract? How does a marriage come about? How do we reify a marriage? It is through a contract. It is through a formulae. So the guardian will say, زوجتك وأنكحتك مخطوبتك. I hereby hand over my daughter's marriage to you by way of example. That's an offer. And then the person will say, قبلت نكاح الناس بذلك. I hereby accept a hand in marriage. So you have that enactment. The enactment takes place how? Through a formulae. So like we have a formulae in terms of marriage, our scholars insist that if you have a sale, that you must have an offer to sell and an offer to purchase. And Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala knows best. So that is what we're going to discuss now bi'idhnillah subhanahu wa ta'ala in this particular regard. We're going to discuss the mu'tamad, the relied upon view in terms of our school of thought, which says there must be a verbal offer to purchase and a verbal offer to sell. But there is an alternate view which we will explore bi'idhnillah subhanahu wa ta'ala, and we will look at that. From the outset, let's not think about how stringent it may be. We were told, and I've heard this a number of times, I heard it from Munata himself. He said that apparently there are certain places, areas in Malaysia whereby the Shafi'is, they practice upon this particular ruling. So whenever you go to a shop in that particular locality, let's say you're purchasing a bread, then the purchaser will say to the seller, اشتريت منك هذا الخبز لي 10 ringgit. And then the seller would say, بعتك هذا الخبز ل 10 ringgit. I hereby purchase this loaf of bread from you for 10 ringgits. And then the seller will say. So even if it's a small sale, a meager item, or a big sale, they would religiously practice upon the formula in terms of the offer to purchase and offer to sell. My point over here would be that if you look at what is the religiously most precautious thing to do, I don't think two people would differ in terms of, if a person is very clear in terms of the offer to purchase and the offer to sell, it leaves no room for any ambiguity. For example, if I were to give Mln Yahya this, I hand it over to him. My expectancy is, look, you know that everything has a price tag attached to it. So my expectancy is going to give me 25, but I don't say it as such. I just give it to him, expecting that he's going to realize that this is a commutative transaction. It's ambiguous by its very nature, and Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala knows best. So while it may be impractical in certain instances, particularly in our climate, to enforce this particular rule of a formula that whenever you purchase something, there must be a verbal offer to purchase and a verbal offer to sell, we must at the same time acknowledge that despite the fact that it may be difficult to practice upon, it is the most religiously cautious thing to do, and Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala knows best. I just want to add some validity for the Shafi view in this particular regard. So let's read through the text. بإذن الله سبحانه وتعالى. It reads as follows: الصيغة البيع كما لا يخفى على عاقل. A sale as is clear, لا ينعقد بنفسه. لا ينعقد بنفسه. Doesn't come about by itself. Previously we were having like a theological discussion. We believe the world as we see it, it didn't come into existence by itself. There was non-existence, and all of a sudden there was existence. In other words, the world came into existence by itself. We believe that that's not possible. That the one moment you have non-existence and the next moment you have existence. That's not possible. We refer to that as الرجحان بدون مرجحين. That you have two possibilities, and then the one possibility is given preference to, but there's no external force feeding that particular possibility. So what happens is, you don't have a sale. We want to bring about a sale. We want to enact a sale. So if somebody tells you a sale comes about by itself, any person with an intellect will tell you that that's not possible. It is not rationally possible for a sale to be enacted by itself. A sale doesn't just come about like that. It needs to be enacted. How do we enact a sale? How do we bring about a sale? تمام. So البيع كما لا يخفى على عاقل لا ينعقد بنفسه. A sale, as is apparent, لا ينعقد بنفسه, is not enacted by itself. إذن لا بد من عقده. If it doesn't come about by itself, then you need to enact the sale. You need to bring it about. وبعبارة أخرى لا بد من إيجاده من العدم إلى الوجود. It is necessary to bring the sale from non-existence into existence. Mln Yahya is laughing because this sounds like kalam, من إيجاده من العدم إلى الوجود, to bring something from non-existence into existence. I was having an interesting conversation with Monna Anis. It would be interesting, I don't know if we have this genre of literature whereby you single out all such issues in fiqh that has a clear theological substantiation. So you have an issue, and the proof for it is theological in nature. So the one example I came across was the example of if a person purchases his son. A person purchases his son on the slave market. So he pays $100,000 for his son. On purchase, his son is set free immediately, because a father cannot own a son. So that's the ruling. The opposite also applies. So a father purchases the son, or the son purchases the father. They are set free on purchase. So now what is the proof for that? The proof for that is say وَقَالُوا اتَّخَذَ الرَّحْمَنُ وَلَدًا. They say that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala took a child. So when we look at Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala and Allah's relationship with His creation, when we look at that particular relationship, it is an ownership. So if Allah is the owner, there can't be a familial tie between the slave and Allah. So now when you look at a father who purchases his son, is there a familial relationship? Yes. Now when there's a familial relationship, there can't be ownership. And therefore ownership falls away. So there's a unique proof in a sense that we have a fiqhi issue, a jurisprudential issue, and the proof for that is very theological in nature. So it would be interesting to see or to single out all of those issues within our fiqh books that appears to be fiqhi in nature, but in terms of the proof, it is a theological proof. So the question Mln Anis was asking me about was, can you pray that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala forgives all of one's sins? So in terms of the Ash'ari creed, it should be permissible. Because we believe that if Allah makes a promise, is it possible for Allah to go against His promise? So we say no. Inna Allah la yukhliful mi'ad. Allah doesn't go against His promise. But if Allah threatens you that Allah is going to punish you, and when it comes time for punishment, Allah decides to forgive you, can Allah do that? We say that's very possible for Allah. The Maturidis say that look, Allah must stick to His wa'id also, even if He just meets it out to one person. It must be meted out. But according to us, no, Allah can simply just forgive everybody. But how come in terms of fiqh that we still present the argument in certain instances that you can't make dua that Allah forgives everybody all of their sins? So here we have an issue. We don't want to discuss the issue per se, but to look at the idea of you find certain fiqh issues that has almost a kalami argument, a theological argument in a particular regard. But be it as it may. Now, وَبِعِبَارَةٌ أُخْرَى لَابُدَّ مِنْ إِيجَادِ مِنَ الْعَدْمِ مِنَ الْوُجُودِ. You want to have a sale. You must bring that sale into existence from non-existence. There's no sale. This item belongs to me. So now I want to have a sale. I need to enact a sale. I need to bring about a sale from non-existence into existence. How do I do that? We're saying you can do it in a number of ways, but according to the Shafi school of thought, you must have an offer and acceptance for the offer. That is what we refer to as a sigha. So we look at that now, inshallah. وَأَقْدُ الْبَيْءِ. So aqdul bay, the sale contract, in other words, when we talk about the sale contract, what do we mean? تحقيق رغبة البيع من البائع. In other words, reifying the desire of the seller to sell, والشراء من المشتري, and a purchasing from the buyer, يحصل بالقول أو بالفعل. So the desire of the seller to sell and the desire of the buyer to buy, that can happen in one of two ways. It can happen through a verbal utterance, or it can happen through a بالفعل, through an action. Now, and this is what happens when we purchase goods. You go to a supermarket, you have a basket, you place items in the basket, and you go to the teller. When you come by the teller, you don't say anything. The teller scans the items. That the teller or the cashier is an agent, and her scanning the items is indicative of an intention to sell. You standing in front of her is not a utterance, but your action is indicates to a willingness to buy. Now, وهذا الثاني, the second, in other words, enacting a sale not through a verbal utterance but through an action. This هو الذي يسمى الفقهاء بيع المعاطات. This is what our scholars refer to as بيع المعاطات. معاطات basically means أعطى يعطي إعطاء, which means to give. So what's happening is that the seller gives the item to the buyer, and the buyer gives the money without there being any verbal exchange. And this is basically what happens in our marketplaces. وبيع المعاطات, بيع المعاطات is explained now. هو أن يعطي البائع المبيع للمشتري. It is when the seller gives the commodity to the buyer. والمشتري يعطيه ثمن, and then the buyer gives him the price. بدون أن يجري الكلام منهما أو من أحدهما, without there being any verbal exchange. That is بيع المعاطات. وبيع المعاطات هذا, this form of sale, whereby there's no verbal interlocution between the two people, أجازه الإمام النووي فيما يعده الناس بيعا. Imam Nawawi rahimahullah, who's referred to, who's one of the shaykhain, who's one of the kingpins in terms of our school of thought, he had permitted it. So if a person asks you, look, you mentioning now tonight that in order for us to enact a sale, there must be an offer and a what do you call it? An offer to purchase and an offer to sell, or an offer to sell and an offer to purchase. There must be that. And we're saying, strictly speaking, according to the Shafi madhab, it must be verbal. I sell this miswak to you. I buy the miswak from you for 25 rands. If you're saying that. At the same time also, there's a view within our madhab, which is referred to as Bay'ul Mu'atat. And one of the greatest scholars within our madhab, Imam Nawawi rahimahullah, he has permitted it. So in other words, there's absolutely no problem with you purchasing something and there's no verbal utterance. You simply give the person the money and he gives you the item, no problems, no questions asked in that particular regard. وَالْمُعْتَمَدْ فِي مَذْهَبِنَا. But we'd like to also look at what is the mu'tamad, the relied upon opinion in terms of our madhab, in terms of the Shafi'i school of thought. So وَالْمُعْتَمَدْ فِي مَذْهَبِنَا, the relied upon view in terms of our madhab. When we say the mu'tamad, it would basically be the muftabihi. If somebody asks you, what is the Shafi position in terms of a sale? Is it enacted, by giving and taking, or is it only enacted by a verbal offer to purchase and a verbal offer to sell? والمعتمد في مذهبنا أنه لا ينعقد البيع بالمعاطات. The relied upon view in terms of our madhab is that the sale will not be enacted بالمعاطات, by way of giving, أي بالفعل، بل لا بد من قول من البائع والمشتري حتى ينعقد. You necessarily have to have a statement from the seller and the buyer. وهذا القول من البائع يسمى الإيجاب. This statement from the seller, we refer to it in Arabic as the إيجاب, offer. والإجابة عندنا نحن معاشر الشافعية لا يكون إلا من البائع سواء تقدم كلام أو تأخر. The unique thing about our madhab is, إيجاب is an offer. So I'm the seller, this belongs to me. So بعتك هذا المسواك ل10 رندا. I sell this miswak to you for 10 rands. Now, according to the Shafi madhab, the ijab is always the offer to sell. So if you approach me and you say to me, look, اشتريت منك هذا المسواك ل10 رندا. I hereby offer to buy this miswak from you for 10 rands. So in English, how do we explain that phenomenon? That you made an offer. And mine would be the response to the offer, the acceptance of the offer. So I say bi'tuka. Though I said it second, whenever the seller talks, whatever he says, that is construed to be the ijab. Even if it's like turned around, we will still say that the offer to purchase is going to be the qabul, and the offer to buy, the offer to sell is going to be the ijab. That's a unique thing about our madhab, and Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala knows best. وَالْإِجَابَ هَذَا قَدْ يَكُونُ صَرِيحًا. When a person makes an offer to sell, it can either be sarih, in other words explicit in terms of its indication. For example, a person says bi'tuka, I sell this to you. Now again here, studying fiqh, the abwab, the chapters of fiqh are like interrelated to one another, and the jargon is sort of like almost the same. So let's again use an extraneous example, and this would be the example of a divorce. So a person wants to divorce his wife. So he wants to enact a divorce. He wants to bring about the divorce. What is he going to do? He's going to use a formula. Now the formula he uses falls into one of two categories. It can either be sarih, in other words an explicit formula. So the person says to his wife, طلقتك. Or in terms of Quran, there's basically three formulae that will be considered to be like clear and explicit. So he either says to her طلقتك, or he says sarrahtuki, or he says faradtuki. He uses one of these three formulae. So he says this to his wife, and then he turns around and he says, no, but I didn't mean a divorce. Are we going to accept his word, yes or no? We're not going to. Why? Because the formula that he used was an explicit formula. In other words, you can't say, no, I used that formula, but I intended something else. Like tallaqa, from a literal point of view, from a lexical point of view, also means to like let go. No, I just wanted to let her go, like temporarily, and then take her back. He can't make an argument. Why? To that end. Why? Simply because these are considered to be explicit formulae. Now, if we come back to what we are discussing, if I say to you, bi'tuka hada, or if you use a malaktuka, I hereby make you the owner of this for 10 rands. And they say, no, I didn't mean a sale. I meant a gift. We're not going to accept that. Why? Because the formula the person used was an explicit formula. So the point being here would be that in a sale you get two types of formulae. It can be sarih, An explicit form, or it can be kinaya. Kinaya. Whereby a person uses a word that it can mean one of two things. And if that's the case, then we ask them, what do you mean thereby? A person, again, in the divorce instance, because it's easy to understand, a person says to his wife, pack your bags and leave. Now, pack your bags and leave can mean a number of things. Pack your bags and leave, spend some time at your mother's place and come back after the weekend. You could very well mean that. Or maybe, I don't know if there's a clearer one, or one that's more understandable. This person wants some space in the togetherness. He says, well, you pack your bags and you leave. But what he means thereby is you spend the weekend by your mom's place. Or you could very well mean, pack your bags and leave, I'm hereby divorcing you. So that's what we refer to in Arabic as kinaya. So when a person uses a formula like that, we're going to ask him, what do you mean thereby? Do you mean a divorce? Or do you mean, and whatever he's going to say, look here, I meant a divorce, the divorce is going to fall. If he says, no, I meant that my wife should, we need some space in the togetherness, she must spend some time by my mother's place, I didn't intend a divorce thereby, we're going to take his word for it. Likewise, when it comes to a sale and you're now wanting to conclude a sale, strictly speaking in terms of the Shafi madhab, and you're using a formula, you have an explicit formula like bi'tuka or malaktuka in terms of the Arabic language, I sell this to you, or I make you the owner of this item. Alternatively, you have an implicit formula, I give this to you for 10 rands. Now, from a Shafi perspective, أعطيتك هذا ل10 رندا, that can mean a sale or it can mean a gift, but it can mean a gift in lieu of a recompense, which may appear in outcome to be the same thing, but because the formula uses different, it can have different implications. And Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala knows best. So, ويكون كناية مثل قول البائع جعلت لك هذا ب1000 رندا أو لك ب1000 رندا والقبول وقول المشتري اشتريت منك بكذا أو تملكت أو قبلت. أما التراضي في قول الله تعالى جل شأنه يا أيها الذين آمنوا لا تأكلوا أموالكم بينكم بالباطل إلا أن تكون تجارة عن تراض منكم فهو أمر باطني لا يطلع عليه ولا وجود له في الخارج فلا بد من عقد البيع بما يمنح الوجود في الخارج حيث العبرة بالظواهر والله أعلم. Here's a very important point, and we can, if you wanted to a large degree, dispense of all the formalities in terms of a sale. But what we cannot dispense of is the principles underlying and governing these sales. And one of the axial verses in this particular regard is when Allah SWT says, Ya ayyuhalladhina amanu, O you believe, la ta'akulu amwalakum bainakum bil batil, that don't devour the wealth of one another in an incorrect manner, bil batil, in an unjust manner, illa an takuna tijaratan, except by way of commerce, by way of a sale if you wanted to, an taradin minkum. But the primary condition of the sale is that it must be based on mutual consent. Mutual consent. Now, mutual consent is not something. Mutual consent is what they say, amr zahiri, amr batin. It's not an external thing. It's an internal thing. Taradi, willingness to sell or willingness to buy. Like you go into a shop, you have a willingness to buy, and you're going to buy the thing, but you go through the steps. But the cashier or the salesperson doesn't know that you came to the shop with a mind to buy this particular item. You're just going through the formalities, but at the end of the day, you're going to buy the item. But does the seller know? No, because that willingness to buy is something which is internal, not external. So how do you let the seller actually know that you have a taradi within you to buy? We have to express that through a formula. In other words, an amr zahir, and that is basically the sigha. Whether you go with the sigha or whether you go with the fi'l, bay'ul ma'atat, there must be something external whereby you express and you manifest that internal desire to trade.
In the context of our environment, a lot of it is implied. So there's no verbal offer to sell, there's a price tag. So as the person entering the shop, your desire is to buy.
No, Jamil.
And based on what you see, which is essentially the offer to sell, which is the price tag, you will then make that conscious decision as to whether now you're either going to buy or not.
Jamil.
And then through that, the cause, or you're going to take the item to the place where this purchase will take place,
No.
and then you pay. And then, although it's not verbal, you get a slip,
No.
and the slip is a written, let's say, contract or kind of between the purchaser and the seller that you then retain.
No.
So it's a little bit, there's a lot of implied things in the way that we purchase today,
No.
as opposed to maybe before, where there was more.
No,
discussion
Jamil,
also.
that's a very nice point, I think, in terms of that taradi that is there from the seller and the buyer, the whole setup and the makeup in terms of circumstantial evidence, it all points to one direction, that there's a willing seller and there's a willing buyer. But the important thing is that from the Quranic perspective is that underlying willingness to sell and to buy must be there. So it talks principally about a willing buyer and a willing seller. A willing buyer and a willing seller. That's why the example sometimes that we use, I don't know if it came already or if it will come later on, in terms of like a person buying or selling on his free will. There must be no coercion. Like a willing buyer and a willing seller. Is it still coming?
Okay.
It came already. So this whole idea about, like in South Africa, we have this issue about land and the redistribution of land, and an argument to a more equitable redistribution of land, both urban as well as rural. The challenge would be that, firstly, that land currently as it stands belongs to its owners. So in order for it to have a redistribution, one of the stumbling blocks in the way was trying to get a willing buyer and a willing seller, or at least a willing seller in this particular instance, to part with that particular lucrative land, be it in the urban areas or to be it outside there. But the important thing is that from an Islamic perspective, we respect the right that a person has over land. Look, if it was usurped, and that's a different case altogether. But if you own land legitimately, then the only way that you can that land is going to be exchanged would be antaradin minkum, when there's a willing seller and willing buyer under normal circumstances, and Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala knows what's best. So there, with that example also we come clear there. Alhamdulillah, barakallahu fikum. وختاما لهذا الركن أقول وبالله التوفيق. And to conclude this particular element, this integral, we have the following to say: لا شك أن اشتراط القول صيغة أدل على ما يبطن العاقدان من التراضي على تبادل الأموال، ولكنه شد خاصة في بيع المحقرات. So that point I raised earlier on, that there's no doubt that the most precautionary thing to do would be, in other words, if you're saying that, look, the willingness to buy and sell is something which is internal, then you must manifest that in a certain way. There's no doubt that when you formally go through the process of making an offer to purchase verbally and offer to sell verbally, that is most clearly indicative of your willingness to trade. When a person is bi'tu and ishtaraytu, that's the point number one. Point number two, وَفُوا عُرْفِنَا غَالِبًا. But it's very difficult to do, particularly, and people will actually, I think they laugh at you. If it would be very dramatic, it would come across very dramatic if you were to go to a cashier and say to the cashier, I hereby purchase this miswak for 10 rands, and then they swipe it. I hereby purchase the 2 liter milk for 27 rands or 25 rands, whatever the case may be, and it will be very laborious. It will be very difficult, particularly in the muhaqqarat, in everyday items, like cheap items, day-to-day items. في عرفنا غالبا يتعامل الناس بالمعاطات في المحقرات. This is also a very important point. In our marketplaces, when it comes to small items, like everyday items, grocery items, by way of example, and then we do mu'atat. We take the loaf of bread, we give the person the money, he gives us the change, and we're on our way. That happens basically. But now, فالأخذ باختيار الإمام النووي في عرفنا عمليا. So taking on the opinion of Imam Nawawi rahimahullah, if you appropriate the opinion of Imam Nawawi rahimahullah, what happens now? practically يشمل القول الآخر بجواز المعاطاة في المحقرات الذي هو قول الإمام المالك. It includes the another view, and that is the view of Imam al-Malik in terms of mu'atat, and that is that mu'atat is valid in terms of meager items. So in other words, we practicing on the qawl of Imam Malik and Imam Nawawi at one and the same time, and Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala knows best. And then also just to when it comes to bigger deals, like bigger items, bigger transactions, like when you lease a house, so you're going to be paying a substantial amount of rental a month. Let's say you're paying 7,500 rands rental a month. There's no way that that's going to be done by mu'atat. Like, the landlord comes to you every month and you just give him a 7,500 and he goes on his way. No, there's going to be a lease agreement. Not only is there going to be, we consider the word to be weightier than the pen, than the written agreement. Not only is there going to be a written agreement, but there's going to be also a verbal acceptance thereof, and Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala knows best.
Is it proportional to the value? Because the understanding is that, like, for the menial items, the day-to-day grocery items, it's proportional to value. So the lease agreement, buying a car, buying a house, the levels to which you would go to in terms of contracts, so that it's clear and explicit, you tend to be more explicit in those high levels.
Absolutely. So the Sharia follows the same type of logic in that particular regard, and people just naturally, when they, when it's something small and then it's okay, you can just exchange like that. But the moment it increases in terms of value, and then people tend to be more formal about it, and it's important, and it's important in a sense that one of the purposes of the class is to educate us more about transactions. So let's look at this now. If you go into the corner shop and you're purchasing a loaf of bread, mu'atat, fine. In other words, you don't exchange a word with the seller. You give him the money, 15 rands, and you take the loaf of bread and you go on your way. No problem. Now, when you're dealing with a stranger, and now you're purchasing a car, or you're purchasing a house, or you're leasing a house, because now it is significantly greater in terms of value, there's going to be certain formalities, both in terms of the prevailing practice within our marketplaces, and also the shara. Like, for example, our madhab would only allow, if in terms of Imam Nawawi, whatever the prevalent custom is, we're going to follow that prevalent custom. So if we're going to go with that, then we're going to write out a contract, or we're going to have a verbal agreement that's very clear in terms of the offer to lease and the acceptance of the offer to lease. We're going to be very clear about that. And we're not going to do it by way of mu'atat. We're not going to do it in an informal way. We're going to do it in a very formal way. So that is the parameters of the madhab, if you look at it. The point which I want to drive home, Mawli Yahya, would be that sometimes we dispense of that. So it's not something that it's not something which of little value, it's something of great value. Now normally we would actually write it out. We'd have a contract for it. But sometimes we don't have a contract for it. When don't we have a contract for it? When it is our brother, our sister, our mother, our father, and so forth. And then if it's difficult to do a contract now, when things go pear-shaped, then things get all the more difficult. And therefore Mawlana Ashraf Ali Thanwi Rahman is very sound advice. He says, ta'asharu kal ikhwan wa ta'amalu kal ajanib. That when you live with one another, then in terms of your social coexistence with one another, then live like brothers. That's how we should be. But when you transact, then they say transact like strangers. And I'm thinking about that now. I don't know how this argument sounds. Just a thought that came to my mind now. When Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala says you must transact amongst people, and then the exchange must be based on mutual happiness, mutual consent. And then mutual consent, how do we manifest that? Through an offer to sell and offer to purchase. Allah doesn't draw a distinction. The verses of what we refer to as, you're going to say am, it is general, whether the person is a family member or not. When it comes to contracting, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala didn't say, look, when you're contracting with a stranger, and then you need to make sure anta radhi minkum. But if you're dealing with your own family, then you don't have to.
Is the Quranic verse pertaining to loans and things, it's also that you should write it down. And the basis for that is that verbally you can forget. Or that's the the way I understand it. And even in contracts, in corporate, it all needs to be written down so that you can go back and refer to it and say, look, this is what we had agreed.
Look, in terms of Quran, the faktubu, we understand it to be something which is recommended.
Okay.
So though it is like the formula used would be a sighatul amr, like a mandatory formula usually, but the scholars, they move it away from that and say it's recommended because of the context. It's almost like writing it down would be better. Now when you consider writing down to be better, and then the alternative is okay, but to write it down would be better. But again, in light of what we are discussing now, and that is when you contract, it should be taradi amongst yourselves, and this should be done by virtue of a contract. If it's small items, and then you just give the guy the thing and he gives you the counter value. But when it's bigger items, we sometimes dispense of it to our own detriment. Why is it not a contract between us? Yes, we are brothers and this and other, and all the more reason why we should contract responsibly. When it's because we're brothers, we should be more careful, because there's a familial tie that links to us. It mustn't be now that as a result of a commercial interaction between us that now compromises our relationship in terms of being brother and sister. And another one where this becomes very problematic. So the principle is ta'asharu kal ikhwan, live like brothers and deal like strangers. Now this doesn't sound palatable, but it is the most sound advice. And who's giving us this advice? Allah SWT is giving us this particular advice. Another type of relationship that sometimes is very much compromised because of a commercial interaction is a marriage. We were speaking now about a person gets married. So now you get married, so the marriage is enacted. The bride, the bridegroom. So now you married. That's a social relationship. And as a result of that particular relationship, yes, there are certain financial responsibilities that fall to the male person. You must provide maintenance and whatever the case may be. But now it comes time to renovate the house. So now purchasing a house, what from an Islamic perspective, purchasing a house has nothing to do with the marriage. The marriage is a social arrangement between two people. That's the partnership going there. It's a social partnership. But what happens now is we conflate the social partnership with the financial partnership. So now we purchase the house, but now what's happening is that in the husband's name, but the wife is paying. And nobody's clear. We need to be clear. If you purchase it, ideally the reality on the ground should be reflected in terms of the contract, ideally. Unless it's excruciating circumstances which doesn't facilitate for that, and then there's like an understanding other than what is in black and white. But that should be an exception to the rule and not the rule really. My point being is that if we manage our marriage according to the way Allah SWT prescribed to us and the way of the Prophet ﷺ, that marriage is going to succeed. Within that marriage, we may have certain financial issues. And now the laws of nikah is not going to govern the financial contracts that we may get into as partners, as social partners. We may get into a financial. Now what governs the financial dealings that you have? The social partnership or the financial laws which Allah SWT has laid down? The financial laws which Allah SWT has laid down. So like when you and I are brothers, that's a social relationship that we have, and we shouldn't do anything to compromise that. And one of the issues, now we're brothers, now we deal in a particular way. No, all the more reason that since we are brothers, we must deal in terms of our finances in a way which Allah SWT is happy with. The same when it comes to a marriage. And there's I wouldn't say equal amount of cases, but I know a number of cases whereby the husband goes at the short end of the stick within a marriage, not socially, I'm talking about financially, and in certain instances the lady goes in with the short end of the stick. She gets married, the husband's business is ailing. These are real examples. She came into the marriage with 1, 2, 3 properties, but those properties belong to her. The fact that she's married to her husband doesn't mean her husband becomes half the owner of it. No, that's hers. ailing business. She now helps her husband, sells the house, puts the money into. She needs to have a. Are you giving the money to him? Are you running business aid? Are you lending the money to him? What is the underlying context? You must be very clear about that in that particular regard, and Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala knows. So these are important considerations. Wallahu alam. Now, تتمة في تعريف البيع وشرحه. إلى هنا إن شاء الله. نحن الآن في 40 دقيقة وإن شاء الله إلى هنا. بارك الله فيكم جميعا.
Question?
تفضلوا سيدي.
No, I'm saying other questions.
Oh, other questions. تفضل.
In regards to the Mln Muhammad Carr, should there be some, because that doesn't mean that every single shop can get thrown out of the window now in terms of the pay that's taking place. So in regards to the commodity itself, it has to be ma'loom. So sometimes because of like the mahkarat, you go like example buying a cup of coffee. So because you do it every day, you don't necessarily look at the price all the time. So now you're also swiping, you're tapping with your card. So you basically just say you want that, you give the thing, you tap, you go. But you didn't even know what the price was. So just if it's ma'rood alay, like if it's just presented like on the screen or it's presented on the machine, but you don't necessarily look at it, will that suffice? Or do you need to know what the price is at least, even though you're not making any verbal?
What I understand from you is something that we would fall into, man. I think it's problematic.
Yeah.
Look, aside from the fact that making the cup of coffee may very well be an istisna, or it can be a salam, but no matter how you construct it, you should know what your point is. Zadakallah wa ilman, may Allah increase you in knowledge, is something which making me conscious of a very important point. What you are saying is the fact that we permit mu'atat doesn't mean that all the other conditions fall on the wayside, and it's 100% valid. So even though like there's an exchange, you should know what you're purchasing, and you should know what the price for it is. Now, I mean, you gave the example of a cup of coffee. There are establishments within Cape Town that they will charge you 44 rands for a cup of coffee. And now you going in there and you're expecting, look here, 21 rand. Okay, it's much for a cup of coffee, but 21 rand, fine, I'm gonna treat myself. But now 44 rand.
In Dubai, it's 100 rand a cup. Is there not any responsibility from the buyer's perspective that you ensure prior to payment that you are willing to pay? So,
Come again?
I'm saying from the buyer's perspective, there should be responsibility to say that, look, you need to ensure that you check the price. So
yeah, no. So it's what Muhammad Tayyib is basically saying, that yes, the buyer should take the responsibility.
yes,
Because like earlier on, if you look at the circumstances, you're going in, that there is a price of coffee. It's basically it's for the taking. Basically, you want to purchase it. So as the buyer, we're talking from the buyer's perspective. As a buyer, if you're going to mu'atat, what happens sometimes to us, we don't know the price, and you to use a vernacular colloquial term, you script, for the price, but then you just let it go, sometimes even in retrospect. But the fact is that you purchase something which you did not know the price of, and then you don't blame yourself. You swear, you swear the teller, and you swear the coffee, and you swear the price, and that becomes a talking point at the coffee table. But at the end of the day, for the fact that you bought something that you didn't know the price of, you're responsible for that. So from an Islamic perspective, you need to know the price of what you are purchasing. And sometimes we're very haphazard in terms of swiping and so forth, and it's about, this is a ni'mah, Allah's given me this money, I'm responsible for it. At least I must know exactly what the price is that I'm paying for. And it will, at the end of the day, it will also help when you just pause for a moment and you ask yourself the price. Like, I paused at a shop that was going to charge me 44 rand for the coffee, and as much as I would love a cup of coffee now, I said, shukran, assalamu alaikum. This is the first and the last time, I told myself, first and the last time you see me. This is the first and the last time you saw me. Look, I could understand from what was the first 16 rand and then the 18 rand and then 19 and 21 rand. When it came to 21 rand, I got worried. You know, like this is not justify 21 rand. You know, and also what happens is, but one shouldn't be thinking like this way also. But it takes 4 rand to make the cup.
Yeah.
If you look at everything there in now, it's 4 rand, and now 44 rand, Habib. So no shukran. You carry on nicely, I'll just carry on nicely. But Sayyid Muhammad Tayyib, mashallah, it was I think it's a very good fa'idah. I don't know if we're being overly pedantic. Mona Isha, I don't know what you think about it, Habib. It's just to pose, like, it happens to us. It's actually, you know, what you're saying to me is like it's a nasiha, and it's like a consciousness that you're creating amongst us. That look, because it does happen. I can think of a few times what happens to me. I say, look, whatever, you know, just smooth.
In fact, a cousin of mine is a financial advisor. I think Mawla met him before, but nonetheless, one of his recommendations in terms of budgeting and becoming more money wise is like, don't use a card for buying stuff. Like, go and draw cash and use cash, because he's noticed that the moment people use cards, they no longer think about what they're spending, because it's just a swipe of a card. Just spend, like, count the balls out and let go.
Yeah.
It's like,
So, and it's a test. It's a Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala has given you wealth, and then, you know, la in shakartum lazidannakum, and here, if you are grateful, Allah will increase you in that. But the fact that if a person just very nonchalantly uses money, which is a blessing which Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala has given us. Now, if you use it responsibly, and then inshallah Allah will increase you in that blessing, and you know, and keep it as a blessing. So this blessing, which is a test in terms of money that Allah has given to us, Allah wants to see that we use the money responsibly. And you know, in other words, when we pay for something, we know this is what we're buying and this is what I'm paying, and not to discover at a later stage. And then you say, in hindsight, I wouldn't have actually done that. This is what it looks like. Many times we do that. We are accountants. We are very professional accountants, because we don't budget the whole month. At the end of the month, now we start looking through did I buy that? There's all history, and then we shout and we fight and we, you know, did I buy, whistle, and that's not proactive in terms of, you know, when you swipe that card, and then you must know what the price you are paying. And the benefit of that is you pleasing Allah, number one, by knowing the price of what you are buying, and number two is there's a consciousness, and the ephemeral, the financial benefit is that when you know the price, you might just stop and say, look here, I'm not going to make this purchase. Allah grant us a tawfiq, barakallahu fikum jami'an.
I was wondering through the class, I don't know if Mala explained it without like translating the ibara, but I haven't seen this thing be written, this qawl, except that attached with is فيما يعد الناس بيعا.
Which one is it, Habibi?
فيما يعد الناس بيعا.
أيوة. But then
so it's,
yeah.
Always comes like this. Did Mala explain this one?
No, is that what is that written in the book فيما يعد الناس بيعا?
Yes, I've read it in the books of the as well.
No. So that's the urfan basically. The urf idea that we sort of like chatting about, but I can't remember like translating it. But Imam Nawawi rahimahullah says فيما يعد الناس بيعا. So let's just say, hypothetically speaking, in our time, if we like sell houses and like we just sell it bil mu'atat, like somebody comes outside and I give him the keys and he has a bag of money and he gives me the money. If that's Imam Nawawi's call, فيما يعد الناس بيعا. But generally we found throughout that people, it would be the meager goods that people deal with in a mu'atat manner. But the other, you know, like pricey things and more cost more money, they're not going to make mu'amala of it in that particular manner.
Even like in the sense where Mawlana says over here that يعطيه هو الثمن بدون أن يجري الكلام بينهما أو من أحدهما. So بدون جري الكلام وكيف يتحصل على الثمن. how does he come to the price if there's no exchange of words? No. So that speaks to our situation. How if knowing if all of these things must be ma'loom, but there's no exchange of words, then how does mu'ata make sense in the condition that you come to a place where there's muhaqqarat and you don't exchange any words, then there's an assumption regarding the price. And for me that almost speaks to like فيما يعده الناس بيعا, not only in the sense of urf, but in the sense that the range, the price range of these things is known. That's why you would be prepared to sort of enact a sale where you just, because there's a price range. No? So now the reason why Mala is, that's a faida, is because the coffee is out of the price range that you buy. So to you can't buy something like that. It's sort of out of the price. But for me the question still like remains that if we are to describe it as he gives they give the money and there's no kalam
from both sides,
and there's tahadi, then how did we decide on the price? So there had to be ilm sabiq.
Yeah.
And so I think that does away with that problem. In a certain sense, but
no, 100%.
At the same time it doesn't, because he didn't make effort to get that ilm sabiq, and then that's what brings that to a problem.
The point being is that the one Muhammad Tayyib is mentioning now would be that look here, the guy doesn't have an inkling of the price.
No.
He's just like unmindful of the price, and basically just prepared to swipe his card to buy that. The problem there would be it's mu'atat, but the mu'atat part is fine. It's the fact that the price is not known. And then the other way would be what Habib mentioned about the fact that there's a price tag on. So you see the price tag, and then so in our times, and what happens, like I don't know how, okay, what Mullah Yahya, you still can get married and so forth. So now when you do your, but now you see what happens is you go to twice gush. Now when you get married you go 3 times gush. The other gush is to Chickers and ShopRite and all of that. You make gush out every in gush and out gush out of every aisle. You go up and down. So what happens is, if you're not going to check, I guarantee you your wife is going to have a look and say, oh, the milk is so much, this is so much. So by the time they take it off and they put it down there, then so the price thing, people are generally particular about it, and so mu'atat happens at the end. So the price tag does assist greatly.
Another thing we do, Mullah, is like you go with a friend, and then you're like, no, take what you want. I say, don't take anything. Don't take what you want, just put it in.
No.
And you don't know what is gonna put in, what's the qima, what's the so it is a gift from your side, so it doesn't really matter about the price.
No.
Because it's a gift. Once he takes it, you accept it and so.
But when you come to the
from
teller,
your perspective, you don't know also.
When you come to the teller and they scan it, you got to look at the price, and then you see. The important point is a consciousness about the expenditure. And I think I myself benefit from it. And many times it is these purchases. Mona was talking earlier on about a friend or cousin that is a financial advisor. Like they tell you about the card, they will also tell you that it's these small things that at the end of the day, like like add quite substantially to your end of the day budget. They have a name for it actually. These treats that you treat yourself with every day, not realizing what it actually amounts to. So following on the law of Islam, it's a consciousness in terms of what you're spending. Don't go niggardly on yourself and miserly on yourself. Bismillah, indulge in what Allah SWT has made permissible for you, but at the same time being conscious in terms of, look here, I know what I'm spending for, and in terms of the contract is valid. Barakallahu fikum jami'an, wa salaamu alaykum wa rahmatullahi ta'ala wa barakatuh.